Pompeii, buried by Mount Vesuvius. This city was frozen in time, providing us with a shocking window into the lost world of the Romans. But that window may close before all her secrets are revealed, as Pompeii comes under threat from all sides. Today, the greatest mystery may be, is the same force that conquered Pompeii the first time rumbling back to life?
We're all really worried that we'll actually be here the next time it erupts.
These walls, they were never meant to withstand all that they've been through. The threats are very real.
Now, experts are trying to solve the lingering riddles before it's too late, as they fan out across the site and use the latest technology and scientific detective work to uncover what Pompeii was like on the eve of its destruction.
We want to know who were these people and how were the last moments of their lives.
It's the year 79 AD. The people in the Roman town of Pompeii are going about their business. Shoppers out in the streets pick up their daily supplies. At home, people prepare for their day ahead. Slaves work away in the city's food industry. The bars are noisy and bustling, and gladiators are preparing for battle. But this day would change these people's lives forever. High above the city looms Mount Vesuvius, one of the most dangerous volcanoes on Earth. Few realize that for many of them, they have just one day left to live. A glowing cloud of volcanic gas and debris begins to roll down the slopes of Mount Vesuvius.
Smoke, ash, debris started to fall on Pompeii. They probably had no idea exactly what was happening. As the day progressed, more and more debris fell, and so this blocked doorways, walls collapsed, roofs collapsed, and so people got stuck in their homes, died that way. There were 6 surges of hot gas that flowed down and instantly killed with the heat whoever was left.
It took just 18 hours for Pompeii to be buried under millions of tons of volcanic ash and pumice. An entire living city wiped out, thousands of its people buried alive. The superheated air burns their lungs and melts their muscles. Their twisted and contorted bodies were quickly buried in ash. When they finally decomposed, their bodies left voids in the ground.
After the decomposition of the body, when the internal organs disappear, they keep this empty space, they form just still the bones, because the bones are very resistant to the decomposition.
Long ago, archaeologists realized that if they filled these voids with plaster, the body's shapes could be revealed. The casts they made have captivated the world.
Pompeii is unique in showing the emotions of people in their death throes and giving us a real human element that we don't get anywhere else. And I think that's what makes people fascinated by Pompeii. And we see them right in the context of their living spaces as they're hiding, or they're trying to leave, or they're rescuing their children.
But many mysteries remain about exactly how these people died. A team of scientists is now studying 15 bodies that were found together in the east of the city. The odd positions these bodies were found in intrigues team leader Lawrence Alapon.
It's very interesting how they found the bodies, because we find several groups together, 3 people together, 4 people together. It seems that they died, maybe helping each other. And we want to know what's happened exactly with these people.
So who were they, and what were their final moments like? Using the latest in high technology, science may finally be on the cusp of solving this 2,000-year-old puzzle. To do so, they're scanning the casts in more detail than ever before, taking high-resolution photographs and then X-rays of their bones locked inside.
We can see the teeth. We know the teeth. We can see about the diet. We can know the sex because we can see very well the morphology of the pelvis. We can know the age because for the growing of the bone.
One cast is particularly well preserved. Lawrence has already unlocked personal details of this man's life.
We know that he was between 25, 30 years old.
This young man also had a military sword, which leads Lawrence to think he was a soldier. But he's hoping to find out much more. He's taking the data back to his lab in Valencia, Spain, to try to put a face to him.
We want to know the last moment of this person, if he suffered or he was afraid, and all this we can see in this face.
The well-preserved sections of the cast are copied and then filled into other sections that are less detailed.
In this part, we can see the complete side of the cast. So we have to take the complete part for make what part is not complete or is missing. The nose is not completely at the end, but we have the width of the nose. So with this reference, we can know how long and which form was the nose. So we use what we have for complete what we have not.
The result is an image that is moving and strikingly lifelike of the young soldier who was buried 2,000 years ago.
When we see the face, we understand a lot of things immediately. The nose, the mouth, everything was people that from the south of Italy or the north of Africa. You give the human aspect, you will feel like that you are living the last moments of these people.
Lawrence has figured out what the man looked like, his occupation and age. But unfortunately, the bigger mysteries remain. What were his and the other victims' final moments like? What was Pompeii really like on the day it was covered in ash? Since it can't be solved here, it falls to other scientists documenting the site. But they're aware that time is running out.
Wind and rain, 3 million people annually who come through Pompeii. These are the things that chip away at the site.
Part of the threat is the numbers of people here, the record numbers that we get into Pompeii, the constant leaning up against walls and scraping against walls, people picking things off. All these issues serve as a very real threat to the preservation of Pompeii.
Centuries of exposure to the elements mean that this city is also coming under threat from potential landslides. One major landslide could bury the delicate buildings of Pompeii before all her secrets are revealed.
These walls, they were never meant to withstand all that they've been through. So we need to find new ways and new ideas for preserving those architectures. They will fall down.
But the deadliest danger still waits on the horizon.
The threat of Mount Vesuvius is a very real threat. Although we stand here in the shadow of the mountain trying to figure out what happened on that day, we're all really worried that we'll actually be here the next time it erupts.
Vesuvius has been described as being one of the most dangerous volcanoes on Earth. Because of the large population in the immediate vicinity of the volcano, there's a very high chance of severe destruction and, of course, high numbers of casualties.
In the wake of these new threats, scientists are now embarking on an ambitious plan to create the first ever 3D model of Pompeii. All its major buildings, monuments, and homes, to create a virtual copy of the city that will last forever. This monumental task is being carried out by architect Raffaele Martinelli and his team. They're documenting over 2,000 buildings and miles of intricate roads. From the ancient Forum in the west to lavish villas in the north, and the magnificent amphitheater in the east of the city. The 3D model is important as it allows us to see the location and current situation as it is now. It's the first time that such an extended and complete digitalization of the whole site has been created. Raphael's goal is to document every inch of this 66-hectare site and help answer unsolved mysteries, from how the Romans lived and interacted to what different areas of the city can tell us about their final hours. We can compare what we are finding, and it helps us see the changes in the buildings over time. And it allows us to plan new repairs to the buildings we're working on and help in their preservation and maintenance. Raphael and his team begin by using a state-of-the-art, high-resolution laser scanner. This machine measures a lot more than 1 million individual points in a second. It means we get very detailed information of the buildings we are scanning. Today, they're mapping the thermal baths in a building on the southern edge of the city called the House of Menander. It's one of the richest houses in all of Pompeii. Today, we are working in the bathroom area. As they scan, surprising new details come to life. Details long hidden from casual view. The team is surprised to discover how comfy a 2,000-year-old bathroom could be, if you had the money. This house has its own small thermal bath. And although it's ordinary for us, this house had hot running water. Once the data is loaded onto their high-powered computers, Raphael can manipulate any of the buildings and monuments that they've scanned. We are getting data about every single wall in the city and eventually the whole site. By combining the work of the scanner and the computer program, the data then gives us a lifelike 3D model. Then we add a color layer, which is taken from photographs of the buildings. Ultimately, Raphael and his team will provide a complete 3D model of the city as it is today, before further damage is done. It means future generations will be able to use this as a starting point to see what Pompeii might have looked like in the 1st century. From the lavish villas to the corner bars, from the amphitheater to the magnificent forum. Of course, none of this would be possible without the huge leaps in technology in recent years. It's revolutionizing the work in the field for Pompeii's scientists and archaeologists.
Well, one way that technology is really helping us to understand the city as archaeologists is through having tools like tablet computers. So, for example, the iPad. In the past, we would come and be reliant upon notepads and pencils and having to take all that paper-based work back to the home institutions to then be digitized and processed and thought about. The advent of tablet technology and also the cloud has helped us to bring those computer databases and bring all of that wealth of information that was typically confined to our offices and our libraries and our museums and bring it to the trench side. So we're now able to excavate trenches here with our hands on the technology, which not only helps us to record in completely different ways, but also to be able to access that information as well. So it has wholly revolutionized the way we study the past.
But state-of-the-art technology is not only helping the work of the scientists at Pompeii. In some cases, it's even challenging their preconceptions. The Quadriporticus in the south of the city. This sprawling building has long been thought of as a gladiator barracks, and that's still what many tourists are told when they visit Pompeii. Professor Eric Paler from the University of Massachusetts has been working this site for almost 20 years. For some time, he's had his doubts about the real use of the quadriporticus.
Over our 4 years of research, there have been a lot of clues that this building has not been used as a gladiator barracks. And not least among these is the fact that the building is elegantly constructed and decorated, including the remnants of fine wall paintings, even in the latrine.
Now Eric's turning to new technology to help in his search for the truth about this building. He's using a handheld structure sensor. It's a versatile, portable piece of equipment to capture 3D details of the site.
The personal scanner for us as archaeologists is a really amazing opportunity. Whereas before, we could take photos, we could make a sketch, but we could never get a really detailed picture of something. Now, with just a few minutes of time, we can not only get the idea that we're interested in, but capture the whole reality around it. And that's revolutionary.
The structure sensor fires a beam of infrared light at the architecture.
It's actually capturing the space as I kind of paint along the wall visually. Now, not only is it capturing the geometry, it's also capturing the imagery. So while we're at the one hand getting the space, we're also getting a sense of the texture.
As Eric traces his tablet across the entire surface of the building, he gets a complete picture, not just of what he can see, but also what he can't.
What we're seeing here is this hole here in the wall, which actually is a major sewer of the city. And you begin to see the scanner moving down the corridor, picking up more and more of the space.
The scanner plots the line of the sewer, giving Eric vital information about how the infrastructure here has been built. But crucially, without having to excavate.
There it is. Let me fill the holes. It's going to use the processor of the tablet to find any gaps that I've missed that are just small or were little areas that were behind a rock. And now I can zoom around in the space of this wall and show you the X-ray view. And now we're back behind the wall, and that is where that sewer is, right here.
The structure scanner is documenting how the sewer changes its path in order to accommodate the latrine. The addition of this new room and its position within the building helps Eric prove his theory that this was not meant for gladiators. Coupled with the quality of the decoration discovered previously, Eric believes this place was simply too elaborate for a group of fighters.
Pompeians went to a lot of trouble to renovate this building in a grand style in the years just before the eruption. The addition of the latrine, together with the rest of the architecture, makes it clear that this was going to be a public space, likely a market building.
It's not only mysteries of Pompeii's buildings that are being solved. Another team is battling to unlock the secrets of a forgotten library of ancient scrolls.
This is really exciting because we are using 21st century technology to read these 2,000 years old texts and trying to virtually unroll it.
Experts now wonder, could long-lost works of ancient literature be hidden under these charred remains? Pompeii was one of the first ancient cities to be uncovered at the dawn of archaeology. But despite over 250 years of traditional digging with spades and shovels, there is much that these ruins keep secret. Now, some scientists are turning to the very latest state-of-the-art technology to help solve age-old mysteries. Some that have been right in front of our eyes for centuries. Just 20 miles to the west of Pompeii lies its sister city, Herculaneum. It too was buried in ash in the eruption of Vesuvius. Scores of people who failed to heed the warning signs died here. Centuries later, in the mid-1700s, treasure hunters came across an extraordinary find. What looked like odd lumps of charcoal and burnt logs turned out to be scrolls of papyrus. Archaeologists realized they'd discovered a vast library of documents, one of the greatest ever found in Italy. Scholars hoped these may be lost classics, but these relics simply crumbled at the slightest touch. Now, for the first time, cutting-edge technology may finally help unravel their secrets.
This in my hands is 15 meters long, but it's only 5 centimeters now. So we have to virtually unroll it to see the letters inside.
In Grenoble, France, in the shadow of the Alps, Dr. Emmanuel Brunn has been given exclusive access to the scrolls. They're using a machine called a synchrotron to attempt to see what's hidden within.
There are two challenges. One is to get the best images here at the synchrotron, and the other is the data analysis, try to really unroll it virtually. And that is difficult because we are dealing with huge amount of data.
During a massive surge from the eruption, the delicate papyrus carbonized so quickly that the scientists believed the inscriptions inside were effectively sealed in. To find out, the synchrotron produces X-rays that bombard the scrolls at close to the speed of light. When they pass through the papyrus and detect sections that contain ink, they're deflected and leave an image that the scientists can read. Although state-of-the-art technology, it is still an incredibly slow process. The ink used in antiquity was made from smoke residue. In density, it's almost identical to the carbonized papyrus itself. But the hope now is that the synchrotron will be able to distinguish between the two.
We have X-rays that are passing through the sample, and we can have, like that, cross-section of 1/10 of millimeter. And thanks to the deviation of the light, we can make the difference between the carbonized papyrus and the carbon-based ink.
Tantalizingly, some intriguing words and phrases are starting to be revealed.
So for the moment, we have isolated two words, which are, the English translation is "they would fall" and "they would say." That's the two words that for the moment has been isolated. Now we can try and see inside, and maybe we can discover new texts that have been lost 2,000 years ago.
Although a painstaking task, once decoded, what will the scrolls reveal? Could they be the diaries of someone writing down their thoughts as the mountain above started to rumble?
The ambition is for medium term, let's say 5 to 10 years. We think that we might unroll what is possible to unroll, and then to isolate the different layers that are glued together and see what is inside the scrolls.
As the search continues to unravel lost secrets from these ancient scrolls, scientific research is being carried out in another part of France to unlock the mysteries of a favorite Roman pastime: drinking wine. Cedric Durand runs a vineyard in Provence, France. He uses ancient texts and images to attempt to recreate the wines that would have been served in the bars of Pompeii around the time Mount Vesuvius erupted.
We know in the text that there were a lot of different wines. Wine for the common people to drink every day in the corner of your house in town or during your hard work.
And when it came to wine with your evening meal, Cedric discovered that the Pompeians had a very different approach to the way we behave today.
Wine were drunk between the meals, not with the meals. So most of the time they don't search to associate, as we do now, wine with one meal.
The process Cedric and his team used to make the wine is the same as it would have been in ancient times. From mosaics, frescoes, and texts, they've been able to accurately reconstruct a Pompeian wine press. It also revealed something unusual about the Romans' taste in wine.
As you can see, this press and this cellar is widely open to air, to oxygen. And the Romans, they used to like this kind of taste, oxidation. They liked it. They liked the taste of an old wine. You say, okay, sometimes you open a bottle, and you say, it's okay, it's too late for this wine. Okay, the Roman would have said, oh, great.
Not all drinking was done at home in Pompeii. The city had many street corner bars. Archaeologist Dr. Sophie Hay spent many years excavating the Bar of Amarantus in the south of the city.
Well, this is a typical Roman bar, a nice marble top. We have a little display cabinet here for the glasses and the wine that he would be selling. The bar culture, I think, would have been very lively, more of a nighttime activity. So when people knock off work, around here, it's an area full of artisans. So we have painters, we have lamp makers, and I think they came in the evening to unwind, gamble perhaps. We find dice in bars, so we know that they were playing games.
Gambling was illegal in Pompeii, but the law wasn't strictly enforced.
We know that even children gambled using nuts, and upper-class Romans gambled sometimes large amounts of money. And so gambling was a regular part of life. And in taverns, it would be gambling mainly on dice games, for instance, or board games.
The ancient city of Pompeii, buried by Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, is once again under threat. Now, scientists are poring over Pompeii to document every inch of this site, to create something never attempted before, a complete 3D model. As they do, surprising clues to the city's forgotten past are emerging. Professor Eric Paler is documenting the city's street network. Today, he's working on the Via Consolare, which was in direct line of the volcano's path and buried deep in ash. Now unearthed, it's revealing surprising details of how this city was organized.
The streets are a multi-purpose form of infrastructure. They both provide a hard surface for the carts to roll along, they provide sidewalks for the pedestrians to move in, and then they create kind of a box-like shape because the water from all the roofs in the city will spill out through the houses, pass into the street, and then wash out as kind of a great storm drain for the city.
Looking closely at the architecture and layout of these drains, Eric has confirmed what the huge stones across the roads were actually for. They kept your feet and toga from getting covered in the muck and grime flowing through the streets.
It's so that at each intersection and at important crossing points in the city, you can get from one point to another without having to dip down into the street. There might be lots of water there could be manure and other things.
Another image that hits all visitors to Pompeii are the deep wheel ruts embedded in the streets of the city. But Eric's detailed analysis of the roads here has provided him with other clues that he believes have long gone unnoticed.
We can see at this intersection how traffic would have moved through Pompeii. On the right-hand side, this corner is angled outward to move traffic and let it more easily turn to the right. The other side, this doesn't have the same angle, so it's not expecting that traffic to do that. We look at this part of the stepping stone, we can see where the cartwheel actually shaved off part of the stone. But it gets much more interesting when we see this side, because not only can we see that the carts are interacting with it, kind of great iron wheel turning down like this, making contact with the stone, and then staying in contact, spreading this pattern across the face of the stone. This can only occur when the cartwheel is turning down like this, which means the cart has to be going in this direction and turning off that way.
This got Eric thinking. Even though these streets are over 2,000 years old, is there some hidden pattern here that might reveal a traffic system that has so far escaped detection?
There's 500 places where you can tell by looking carefully at the way the cart wheels would interact with the stones that a cart was moving in a particular direction to create that actual pattern of wear.
He then crisscrossed the entire city, confirming his findings on his tablet. Slowly, he began to notice a pattern emerging.
You see here, we've got a northbound and a southbound right next to each other.
By recording these tiny details on his tablet, Eric created a digital record of all Pompeii's street movements. And it revealed something groundbreaking.
The entire city had a form of traffic control that had escaped our detection for that whole time. The first time I took all the data and then pushed the button, out came the first map of the traffic system of Pompeii that anyone had ever seen.
What Eric has discovered is a familiar system of one-way streets.
Ancient cities like Pompeii are organized in many ways a lot like modern cities today, like Manhattan with a grid system. The traffic that moves through modern New York and ancient Pompeii had to face the same kinds of intersections, square intersections that force traffic into certain patterns and not into others.
And Pompeii certainly needed organized streets. Although only 12,000 people lived here, thousands more traveled into the city as it was home to one of the most important buildings in Pompeii, the massive amphitheater. The amphitheater dominates the eastern edge of the city. It's the most imposing structure left standing in Pompeii.
The amphitheater in Pompeii is the oldest one that we know of. So the amphitheater, which means a double theater, was an invention in Italy. So the Greeks already had theaters with seating in 180 degrees. The idea of the amphitheater or arena was 360-degree seating. And so from anywhere in the stands, you could watch the spectacle in the middle of the arena. Arena itself simply means sand, because sand would be put in the center to absorb all the blood and so on from the spectacles.
And the current work of the scientists here means that a complete picture of this massive structure can now be seen.
Well, the amphitheater here compares to all of the amphitheaters in Italy in that it's the first stone-built structure of its kind in all of Italy. As a 20,000-seat amphitheater, it certainly was more than what was necessary for one single town, but it's certainly serving the rest of the region.
As a modern generation of experts continue to fan out and document this site, long unnoticed details are coming to light.
It was a long day, and they had all sorts of contests throughout the day. In the summer, it would be hot, but they allowed for that by having awnings that would have been hauled out on pulley systems to cover all of the crowd to keep them protected from the sun.
And the varying size and shape of the seats reveal there was a strict hierarchy for those who came to watch.
Women and slaves tended to sit further back up into the stadium, so it was very tiered depending on one's class and one's gender. The elites and the town leaders down towards the front.
But all these groups shared one thing in common: their love of the Gladiator games. They were the equivalent of the major sporting events that we attend today. Historians now understand that gladiatorial combat was more complicated than simply throwing victims to the lions. Many of the men involved were very much the sports heroes of their day. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of these celebrities still exists on the walls of Pompeii. Hidden away not far from the amphitheater is this tiny 2,000-year-old graffiti. Experts believe it's a drawing of a gladiator known as a retiarius. He wore a guard on one arm. Part of his armor was a plate tied to his left shoulder to help protect his head. He fought with a net and a trident. As other graffiti shows, the sworn enemy of the retiarius was the Murmillo. He had a guard on one arm and a single leg guard, his face hidden behind a full cover helmet. He fought with a short sword and a large shield. Uncovering 2,000-year-old etchings at Pompeii has provided vital insight into what went on here during Roman times. But state-of-the-art scientific technology is helping throw new light on the ancient world of Pompeii. So far, scientists have been able to put a face on some of the victims and brought crumbling streets back to life. But the very walls of this city are now at serious risk of being lost forever.
These walls have experienced so much turmoil and upheaval from being built and experiencing earthquakes and the volcanic eruption that destroyed it, right through to having been exposed and then systematically neglected and trampled over by tourists over the past 200 years. Indeed, most of the walls that we walk through here have been exposed longer in the modern period than they ever existed in antiquity.
And now, many of the precious frescoes and wall paintings are deteriorating rapidly. Grime from modern pollution has coated them in film. And future tremors could wipe these fragile images away for good.
The importance of the frescoes is extraordinary. They allow us to reconnect with the people who once lived in these very homes.
That's one of the most important types of evidence we have from Pompeii is wall paintings. So while wall paintings have survived in other places, we just don't have the amount that there is in Pompeii, which reflect the artistic interests of people and show scenes of mythology and so on, but more crucially for us, precisely reflect the kind of things that occurred in houses and bars and shops and so on.
Early efforts to preserve them with substances like wax and oil did more harm than good. It actually sealed in moisture, which over time has damaged these precious decorations. To attempt to save them, scientists are turning to laser technology.
The laser is one of the most powerful. It has a wavelength of 1064 nanometers, so it's in the near-infrared range of the spectrum, so it's not visible to the eye. And it has a maximum energy of 900 millijoules and a very short pulse. So it's a very, very powerful laser, and we have to calibrate it and to choose the minimum and the maximum energy for it to work properly and safely.
And restorers are developing relatively simple techniques to improve the process.
Sometimes it is very useful to use water to wet the surface. This way the colors become brighter and the removal is easier. And then the water also cools down the surface, and when the laser heats up the water, this helps the ejection of the unwanted material.
Pompeii is one of only a handful of sources of Roman wall decorations on Earth. They display astonishing depictions of everyday life and are a wealth of vital information for historians.
Thanks to this 21st century technology, we also can shed some light on the habits of the Roman people and to see how they were dressed, how their hairstyle was. And so it also helps to have new knowledge about the history of these people and of our country.
It's a technique that has now brought Pompeii's stunning Villa of the Mysteries back to its original glory.
The faces are now shining as bright as when they were first painted.
And as more and more frescoes are revealed, we learn more about what the interiors of the homes of Pompeii looked like. But scientists aren't just concentrating on what's above ground. they're also looking for clues underground. Pompeii had a sophisticated plumbing and water system. There are over 40 fountains in the city, and many of the grand houses had running water. But Pompeii's gutters and drains can also answer questions about the citizens' lifestyles and what they consumed. It may not be the most glamorous investigation at Pompeii, but if someone doesn't do it now, a wealth of information may be lost forever.
The latrine deposits in Pompeii are great assemblages because people maybe indiscriminately throw things down in the latrines, or as it's a fast way to dispose of some rubbish that I may have been working on in the kitchen next door.
McKinnon has sifted through tons of ancient garbage looking for clues, but the most revealing might come from animal bones. What he's discovering paints a picture of the final meals of many of Pompeii's doomed citizens.
There's lots of information that registers on the bones themselves that tell us about the preparation process and the cooking process.
Today, he's investigating a set of remains found in a latrine in the house of Marcus Lucretius, a once lavish house in the center of Pompeii. The remains form the top layer of the latrine, so in terms of chronology, this waste is from a time not long before the eruption of Mount Vesuvius.
It has a big concentration of materials that look like it came from a wealthy feast. It has songbird remains, which are a delicacy in antiquity. Lots of fish, sea urchins and shellfish, so it's special.
The latrine also contains the bones of pigs, a widespread commodity in antiquity. But by analyzing the state of their teeth, McKinnon can deduce the age of these animals, and he spots something startling.
This particular assemblage has the highest concentration of young pigs from Pompeii. Younger pigs under 2-3 months of age would be a delicacy in Pompeii. The wealthier people were the ones who had the resources to access them.
This paints a vivid picture of a banquet enjoyed by some of the richest people in town.
So it's a chance to impress one's friends, be the talk of the town.
As a clearer picture of the lifestyles of the Pompeians emerges, it's the future of the city that is fast becoming the main focus. The volcano Mount Vesuvius looms large over the town of Pompeii, an ever-present threat waiting to erupt all over again. And as scientists and archaeologists race against the clock to create a complete 3D model of Pompeii, they're now aware of a new danger: potentially catastrophic landslides within the city. Scientists believe that as the rain flows down from Vesuvius, it's starting to move the huge mounds of earth in the unexcavated areas of the site, and will collapse the buildings and monuments that they're now mapping. In a bid to find out if their worst fears might be realized, they're now looking to the heavens. We started working with the Italian Space Agency. Their Cosmo SkyMed satellite allows us to see every little movement of the ground in the unexcavated areas, and of the buildings and walls, which often fall underneath the heavy rains. This system is accompanied by wireless sensors on the ground, which send us a warning for every little movement of the buildings and of the earth around them. The satellite keeps track of the signals from the wireless transmitters, making a recording every few minutes, so that over time, scientists will be able to detect the slightest movement of the buildings and of the ground they stand on.
Pompeii is
the biggest archaeological site where they are experimenting with these different technologies. We still don't know what the result will be, but it will enhance our knowledge, which will help us analyze all the data and then use it for the purposes of preservation. But for the scientists working at Pompeii, rainfall may be the least of their worries. The reason this city was stopped in its tracks was the catastrophic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. That all started with innocent wisps of smoke appearing from the volcano. And now, the indications are that Mount Vesuvius may very well be due to make its presence felt once more.
Because there is the possibility that it will be at least of a modest explosive size, it may produce small pyroclastic surges which will affect most of the mountain. And consequently, the current emergency plan is that as soon as there's signs of reawakening the volcano, the first step is to evacuate 600,000 people.
As well as the satellites keeping a close eye on minute movements of the landscape, a nearby monitoring station in Naples is keeping watch 24/7 on the activity of Vesuvius.
The volcano is permanently monitored with a network of seismometers and ground deformation stations. And the signals from these instruments are sent directly to the Vesuvius Observatory. So if you go and visit it, you will see banks of screens that's showing changes in seismicity and movements of the ground minute by minute.
The information they're studying here keeps them updated about every minor movement in the Earth around the volcano and acts as an early warning system for future eruptions.
Should there be any evidence that the eruption could be of a size of the Pompeii eruption, then consideration would also have to be given to the potential threat to Naples itself.
Cutting-edge science, along with physical preservation, have deepened our understanding of this fascinating ruin.
What we see here is a city that is crumbling, that is in it on its last legs, but also an effort to try to save it for the future.
If we lose the city of Pompeii to a volcanic eruption or to some other form of devastation, what we lose is the greatest single place to walk into the past and to exercise one of those great things that technology can't yet do, maybe hopefully never will be able to do, which is to imagine, to reconstruct in our mind from the information in front of us and to see a past that isn't actually there, but you can feel and know from inside your mind.
Preserving this site is the biggest fight, the biggest challenge for everyone here, technicians, scientists, archaeologists, in Pompeii.
All the new technologies that are being employed here and the new ways of documenting this fascinating city will soon provide us with an incredibly detailed virtual view of Pompeii. A world that neither Mount Vesuvius, nor wind, or rain will ever be able to destroy. A perfect copy of an ancient city that science hopes will forever stand the test of time.
In the year 79 AD, the legendary Italian volcano Mount Vesuvius erupted. It buried the nearby Roman town of Pompeii. Just over 1,000 bodies have been found in the partly excavated streets and houses. Visitors are still told that the victims were all crushed by a huge deluge of rock. But there is a mystery here. Few of the bodies show any sign of damage or violence. Nor did they succumb to boiling hot lava. That would have taken a week to reach them, plenty of time in which to escape. Their town is decimated, yet the bodies seem to be virtually intact. Now forensic science is rewriting history. In Pompeii, there's evidence of one of the rarest of all volcanic phenomena. the latest data completely disprove the traditional explanation. For the first time, it's possible to create the definitive hour-by-hour account of that terrible day, and to answer the riddle of Pompeii. Mount Vesuvius and Old Pompeii are now both engulfed by the urban sprawl of Naples. Vesuvius is still a destroyer. It's erupted over 30 times in the last 2,000 years. For centuries, lava has regularly flowed down the mountain and damaged the towns beneath. Professor Haraldur Sigurdsson is the foremost authority on Vesuvius. He studied its every eruption, including the most recent, in 1944.
But the new cone of Vesuvius is right behind me here. That's the active cone. It's been built up since the formation of the caldera. And that cone continues to erupt as recently as 1944, when this lava flow came down the slope from the crater and flowed down here, down into the caldera. As it accumulated there, it continued to float down towards the west, and then down off the volcano into the built-up areas, following down one of the major valleys that issues from the volcano. And there it flowed into and through the city of San Sebastiano, destroying many houses and causing tremendous damage.
However, while it brought heartache to thousands, only 20 people actually died.
It is very rare that people get killed by lava flows because simply you have a lot of time to move out of the way, but you lose your houses, lose your land, lose your fields, and so the destruction is very extensive, but the death toll is almost nil.
So why was the death toll so high during Vesuvius's most famous eruption in 79 AD? It was 1,500 years before someone stumbled on the first clue. In 1594, the architect Domenico Fontana supervised the digging of a tunnel through the area to divert water to this munitions factory, which is still in use. His workmen hit painted walls bearing the inscription, Pompeii. But it was only in 1748 that excavations started in earnest. Soon, workmen were pulling out treasure after treasure. The excavators were surprised at how easy it was to dig. For the volcanic material that covered the town was not rock-hard black lava, but lava smashed into billions of particles of dust and pumice. And buried in it lay the strongest clue to the mystery. In 1863, the archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli noticed that the skeletons of the Pompeians were usually found inside hollow cavities. He decided to pour plaster into them, and the shapes they produced were amazing. Buried under meters of volcanic material, the soft tissues of the bodies had rotted away, leaving only the bones and an exact hollow impression of the corpse. People marveled at the sleeping dead. But scientists were baffled. Of the 1,000 bodies exhumed, few had horrendous injuries. Few were trapped or crushed. It's only now, with the invention of 3D MRI scanning, that strong clues to the cause of death can be gleaned. At the University of Naples, Professor Francesco Sasso has scanned 5 skeletons found just outside Pompeii during recent road widening.
If you look at this skull, there's an anomaly. We found in the left maxillary sinus tubes a big plug of white powdery material. In particular, if you look closely, you can see these white particles here. It looks very like dust.
It seems that the victims were exposed to extremely dusty air. But could that really have accounted for so many deaths? Haraldur Sigurdsson has tried to answer this riddle for the last 20 years. He's conducted an exhaustive study of the rock strata at many sites around Vesuvius and has just completed his calculations.
We are here at Oplontis, just to the southwest of the volcano. It's an imperial villa, but it's also a place where we have a complete stratigraphy. All of the layers are represented here at Oplontis from the 79 eruption. Now I'm standing on the Roman soil or surface, ground level, and here's the first pumice fall represented by this layer.
Sigurdsson has established that all of this material fell from the sky like rain. Could the Pompeians simply have been buried alive? To find out more, Sigurdsson first turned to the only eyewitness account of the eruption, that of writer Pliny the Younger. Pliny tells us that he, his mother, and his uncle, Pliny the Elder, were 30 kilometers west of Vesuvius at the port of Misenum. His uncle was the senior official in the area and commander of the Roman navy. Pliny the Younger's account focuses on the heroic death of his uncle, but he also provides vital clues to the mystery. Crucially, he times the start of the eruption at 12 noon.
On the 24th of August, at noon, my mother drew his attention to a cloud of unusual size and appearance. He called for his shoes and climbed up to a place which would give him the best view of the phenomenon. Its general appearance can be best expressed as being like an umbrella pine, for it rose to a great height on a sort of trunk and then split off into branches. I imagine because it was thrust upwards by the first blast and then left unsupported as the pressure subsided. Sometimes it looked white, sometimes blotched and dirty.
Pliny's description of a column of cloud stretching many kilometers above him has perplexed scientists. Could the eruption really have been this big? Sigurdsson has measured the total amount of material the volcano dropped in the area and believes that Pliny was absolutely correct. Rather than a slow lava flow, the 79 AD eruption was an event that only happens every 2,000 to 5,000 years. A massive explosion of molten rock.
A single volcano has many different styles of eruption, as Vesuvius does. We know that Vesuvius produces lava flows, signifying the presence of magma that is poor in gases. It produces very explosive eruptions, some of the most explosive on Earth, signifying that it also has magmas that are very gas-rich.
Under Vesuvius is a magma chamber, an underground tank of molten rock. From the crater above, Sigurdsson has calculated it is 5 kilometers in diameter and 3 kilometers down. As it fills up, it causes earthquakes and heating of the groundwater. The rock above it eventually splits. A fissure appears, and a thin column of magma makes its way to the surface. If it leaks out slowly, it results in a lava flow. But in 79 AD, the column couldn't squeeze out of the surface because of dense rock formations. Over hundreds of years, the pressure built up.
If you have a break of hundreds of years, or an extensive break of no activity, magma is still coming up into the reservoir, and as it accumulates in the reservoir, that magma undergoes certain chemical changes that lead to a buildup of gases in the magma.
At noon, on the 24th of August, the buildup of gases cracked the volcano's cone. The trapped molten rock shot up into the air, fragmented and cooled into billions of particles of dust and pumice. High-altitude winds blew it to the southeast. Within minutes, Pompeii was at the center of the deluge. But this isn't what killed the victims. The eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD was the biggest for 4,000 years. Geological data shows that it ejected 10,000 tons of material every second. Such was its power that rock flew many kilometers up into the sky and then hurtled down towards Pompeii. However, Professor Sigurdsson's theory is that most of the population survived the downpour because the material was too light to kill them.
When the magma is moving up from great depth, it's subject to great pressure deep in the earth. All the gases are pressed into the magma, into the liquid. But when the liquid moves higher, the gases come out and they form bubbles, and the bubbles get bigger and they get more numerous. And they effervesce, if you like. It forms a foam. The magma turns into foam. The foam is filled with gas cavities that are filled with steam. And that foam is then ejected explosively and breaks up, solidifies in the atmosphere. The magma, or the liquid surrounding the bubbles, forms glass, volcanic glass, and what we end up with is pumice. Very lightweight material, low density, floats on water, but it is rock. It's rock full of bubbles.
Indeed, Sigurdsson is able to calculate how quickly the pumice dropped. By comparing the crater size to how far pumice travelled, he can show that it fell at around 20 centimetres an hour. And according to Pliny the Younger, people were able to protect themselves.
as a protection against the falling objects, they put pillows on their heads, tied down with cloths.
Two writers, 2,000 years apart, show that the population of Pompeii should simply have been able to walk away. So why didn't they all leave? It seems at first people did not know what was happening. Educated Romans certainly knew what volcanoes were. Pliny the Elder wrote about Mount Etna in Sicily and was aware of the existence of lava flows. He would also have read the engineer Vitruvius, who wrote 50 years before him. He believed Vesuvius was a volcano, but that it was dormant and therefore no cause for concern.
At that time, the crater of Vesuvius was described as being draped with vegetation and difficult to access. Also, we have evidence from frescoes. There's a famous fresco that was found in Pompeii that shows the volcano as being forested.
This heavy vegetation indicates that Vesuvius hadn't erupted at all for a long time. Modern geological studies suggest for around 400 years. But while they'd never seen or heard of Vesuvius erupting, the Pompeians were no strangers to earthquakes. In 62 AD, one nearly wiped out the town. Historian Ray Lawrence has studied the houses of the town and the surrounding area of Campania.
Campania is associated always with earthquakes, so there's a certain amount of, yes, it's Campania, so there are earthquakes. So after the AD 62 earthquake, Seneca would tell us that somebody's mad if they want to give up coming to Pompeii, for instance, because they're frightened of earthquakes. He'd say that's the wrong motive.
In fact, archaeologists have found strong evidence of earthquake activity in the weeks leading up to the eruption. The Villa Castiamanti on the main shopping street was a typical large townhouse which had suffered recent damage.
Before the 24th of August AD 79, this area had suffered very badly from earthquakes and there was a need to reconstruct things. This is a house where a lot of change has happened because we're not just dealing with one house, we're dealing with a block of houses which are all interconnected. So different things are happening in different parts of the house. It's thought that in the back, for instance, some painters had been working that morning because there's a paint pot found in the corner.
And it's not just the Villa Castiamanti. There are patched up masonry cracks and patched up frescoes all over Pompeii. The Pompeians may not have known that imminent volcanoes also cause tremors. When the huge eruption of rain and pumice started, they must have been scared. But their experience of earthquakes told them to sit it out rather than flee.
Within the structure of the eruption itself, that there's a certain amount of waiting and seeing, and then somebody comes to tell you, you're an idiot unless you leave. Even people like Pliny the Younger sits down and reads from Livy's History of Rome, rather than leaving the building. And it's only when one of his uncle's friends, who's from Spain, comes to see him and says, look, why don't you leave? That's the obvious thing to do at this moment in time. The building will fall apart and you should simply go.
A new mapping study by Professor De Carolis has analysed all the old excavation records. He has plotted what bodies were found where, and it confirms that people did show a degree of hesitation before leaving.
What we can say is that the first natural reaction of those who had relatives or friends in the city must have been to go and look for them, as well as to go and look for the most precious objects in their homes in order to take them away. This is now scientifically confirmed, as many human bodies had by them many precious objects. Therefore, whoever managed to escape, must have thought of taking away their personal properties. We also find, and this is quite obvious, their house key. I mean, many bodies were found with the iron house key of their own homes, so those who ran away first locked their houses and then left. We know this for sure.
This early hesitation was to prove fatal. Sigurdsson's calculations show that the rate at which the volcano ejected material actually increased in the first few hours.
This pumice fall begins to form probably around noon. And then as you see it's getting coarser, the coarsening of the pumice fall is due to increased intensity of the eruption. The eruption is getting more violent. There's more energy. There's a higher rate of magma. Initially, the magma was coming out at the rate of about 1 million kilograms per second. Towards the upper part of this layer, we call this the white pumice, towards the upper part of it, it was coming out about 10 million kilograms per second. So there's an increase, tenfold increase in the rate of flow of the magma out of the volcano. This particular stage of the eruption we call the Plinian stage, in honor of the Plinies. The Pliny the Younger was the first one to document and observe this type of activity, and he observed an eruption column that went up to great height in the atmosphere. Actually, we've done some modeling and investigations on this particular deposit and that phase of the eruption, and we know that it started off as about a 17-kilometer high eruption column, and it went up to about 32 kilometers.
In fact, the heat generated by the eruption was so great that the pumice was carried 30 kilometers above the Earth's surface, 3 times higher than airliners fly. With Pliny providing the start time of noon, Sigurdsson's flow rate data show that by 4 in the afternoon, Pompeii was smothered in a blanket of pumice nearly a meter deep. By this stage, the roofs all over the town were under unbearable pressure. Between then and the end of the day, almost all of the 20,000 people archaeologists estimate lived in the city did finally leave. But 1,044 bodies have been recovered within the city walls. Why did they, and perhaps even more, stay? New findings suggest that not everyone may have been able to flee. Professors Ciparolo and Cascino have been able to extract DNA from 13 skeletons found at a house in the town's main shopping street, the Casa Polibio. The results show that there were strong bonds of attachment, lovers, family.
In the people from Polibio's house, there were 2 people with a disease, spina bifida, although we can't say if it would have affected them in any way. But there are telltale signs for why they may have stayed. One of these people was a young pregnant woman at the end of her term, very close to giving birth. And this perhaps could be the reason they decided not to flee, to stay in the house and to hope to save themselves.
One decides to stay because one lover is sick and they can't flee because they want to remain together. That seems reasonable to me.
These pictures show some of them in the position they were found. Two of them in particular, these two, are holding hands. This, of course, suggests a very strong family bond. We think that one of the two is a teenager, so he's probably holding his father's hand.
In addition to DNA testing, Professor Sasso has found that in the group he has analysed, there was someone who may have been in too much pain to flee.
Well, this subject suffered from toothache, a serious toothache in the roots, and he also suffered from an abscess of the maxillary sinus. It's one of those toothaches where half the face is swollen up and in great pain. That's one reason he may have stayed. If there were other reasons, we don't know. But he must have been somebody with a strong resistance to pain. He probably was a soldier or a gladiator. This perfectly healed wound, it's obviously a sword wound, shows he was a fighter, a tough man.
Whether they were forced to stay or whether they fled, the population of Pompeii must have feared the worst. Bizarre weather could only have added to the sense of doom.
All of the elements are working against you there. Continuous lightning strikes, because one of the properties of a big explosive eruption like this is that it basically short circuits the electrical conditions between the Earth and the upper atmosphere, and that produces almost continuous lightning in the eruption cloud. So that would have been a frightful scene.
Pliny the Elder's predicament illustrates the growing chaos. He tried to lead the Roman navy to the coast near Pompeii to evacuate refugees, but they were beaten back by huge flows of floating pumice. He eventually landed at Stabiae and took refuge with his friend Pomponianus. But soon the rescuer became a hostage, finding the door of his room blocked by the pumice fall.
They debated whether to stay indoors or take their chance in the open, for the buildings were now shaking with violent shocks and seemed to be swaying to and fro as if they were torn from their foundations. Outside, on the other hand, there was the danger of falling pumice stones, even though these were light and porous. However, after comparing the risks, they chose the latter.
From Pliny the Younger's account, it seems that his uncle, Pliny the Elder, made it to the relative safety of Stabiae Beach by the late evening. But by that stage, around 9 or 10 p.m., the eruption was at its most powerful. In Pompeii, the pumice was getting very deep.
So let's look at the pumice that has accumulated here to a height of, or a thickness of almost 2.5 meters. Of course, we begin here around noon on the 24th on the ground, on the Roman ground that I'm standing on, and here it was covered with big amphoras. And then during the early stages of the eruption, we have an accumulation of the white pumice falling out of the sky and accumulating here gradually during the afternoon of the 24th. And around our late afternoon, early evening, we begin to see a change in the color of the pumice fall, turning darker gray. That continues to fall up to about 3 or 4 in the morning on the next day, when the first surge reaches Pompeii, and that is that dark band that we see on the top of this excavation.
With no lava flows and only a few large rocks in the deposit, scientists have naturally assumed that this never-ending cascade of pumice is what eventually overcame the victims. But astonishingly, Sigurdsson's findings show this is not the case.
see the tremendous effects of that surge on the people, and we see where the people were in Pompeii. They weren't down here at ground level, they weren't walking around, they weren't being buried by the pumice fall, but rather they were walking on top of it, and we see the remains right here on top.
Amazingly, Sigurdsson's theory is that just about everyone survived the constant pumice fall by continuing to walk on top of the ever-growing carpet of rock. Their cause of death was about to arrive. When the eruption finally subsided, Pompeii was buried in 4 meters of pumice. Centuries later, as the excavations commenced, a pattern started to emerge. A few bodies were found deep down, indicating they died early on. They appeared to have been hit by falling masonry. But the vast majority were found much higher up, nearer the surface, indicating they died later. In fact, they were all found at exactly the same level, strongly suggesting they died at virtually the same time, and none of them had any apparent injuries.
I think they died for lack of oxygen.
By suffocation.
By suffocation.
One of them had his mouth open. It was shocking because if you look at the excavation pictures, when the skeleton was found, his mouth was wide open for lack of oxygen.
Same thing with the horses. Their head was turned. They were on the floor, but their mouth was turned up, so they clearly lacked oxygen.
The position of the bodies is powerful evidence. It strongly suggests that the victims died by inhaling something lethal. But what?
Some of the molds of the victims of Pompeii seems to confirm this hypothesis. Some of them are lifted up on their arms, as if craning their necks upwards towards some slightly cleaner air. We are still waiting to prove this, but they must have had some serious breathing difficulties.
So what could have made the air suddenly so deadly? If breathing dust had been the cause, surely they would all have died at different times because of different lung capacities and hiding places. It is only now, after 20 years of painstaking analysis, that Sigurdsson can prove what really happened. Vesuvius generated what is now known as a pyroclastic surge.
I was very lucky to be involved in the research on a very similar eruption that took place in 1982. And that was the eruption of El Chichon volcano in Mexico that killed about 2,000 people. And in that eruption, several surges were produced that were witnessed, and people were killed in those. And I was on the scene there about 2 days after the eruption and was able to study those surges, and they look exactly like these surges.
Sigurdsson's identification of surge layers in the rock at Pompeii was the answer scientists had been waiting for. Not every volcano develops a surge. It's a complex phenomenon where the eruption can be seen like a jet engine. The power it's generating is keeping the whole column up in the air. But as the crater around the eruption starts to cave in, it interrupts the flow of power. The column briefly collapses. The result is a falling cloud that hits the ground at over 200 kilometers an hour. It spreads out over a vast area like a giant dust-filled hurricane, knocking over walls, destroying everything in its path. The mystery of the surge is that as it settles, it leaves nothing but a very thin layer of ash, which is quickly buried by further pumice fall.
Over here, we go to the wall of the deposit, where we can see the other surges quite clearly. We have the fault deposit, the pumice fault deposit here, quite large pumices because we're fairly close to the volcano. And the first surge forming this thin layer, followed by another stage of fallout. So the first surge represents the first collapse of the eruption column. Instead of a very high Plinian eruption column, which produced this material, we now have a collapse or a fountain of ash and pumice coming out of the volcano, flowing down the sides and creating a glowing avalanche of pumice and ash, reaching this site in a few minutes.
Sigurdsson has calculated that Vesuvius took 20 hours to eject all of its material. In the resulting 4-metre thick pumice layer, there are 6 surge layers. By measuring where they are, Sigurdsson is at last able to show exactly when they happened. The first was at 1 a.m. It spread west and pulverised the town of Herculaneum. At 2:15 a.m, there was a second, bigger surge. At 6:30 a.m, 18.5 hours after the eruption had first started, an even larger third surge was generated. Luckily, it ran out of energy, just reaching the northern walls of Pompeii. Nevertheless, it must have made the air thick with dust. At 7:30 a.m, still choking and wheezing, the inhabitants of Pompeii were overrun by surge number 4. They were slain by an ash and dust-filled wind that swept over them at more than 200 kilometers an hour. Not only that, it was also viciously hot.
Sort of make our way gently on top of or into the pumice fall. We see that the surge is actually a very thin layer. Surge number 4. It's only about 5 to 10 centimeters in thickness, but this surge and the subsequent surge over here are the deposits that contain all of the human remains, or almost all of the human remains in Pompeii. In addition, they contain building material that was carried along in the surge, and that is now being preserved. Over here to my right, you see several of the bodies of the people that were suffocated and asphyxiated in the surge because of the very high heat and searing high temperatures and being choked essentially on inhaling the hot ash and dusty air. So this is one of these excellent sites where we can see the relationship between the volcanic processes, the generation of the hot surge, and how it affected the people, demonstrating to us clearly what was the lethal agent of the eruption here in Pompeii. It was the 4th surge.
In fact, there is strong evidence that the pyroclastic surge was at least 100 degrees Celsius, hot enough to boil water.
The temperature around the victims must have reached rather high levels. Why do I think the temperature was that high? Because we didn't find any bacteria in the soil surrounding the victims, but we found bacteria in the natural cavities of the bone remains of the victims. This means that the temperature was hot enough to boil and sterilize the soil.
The victims of Pompeii had a horrible death. A thick, red-hot hurricane roared in their faces like a jet blast. It seared their skin and filled the insides of their mouths, noses and lungs with scalding dust. That is why many look like they are sleeping. They fell to the ground, struggling in vain to shield themselves from the hellish, burning wind. But as quickly as it came, the surge disappeared, leaving its victims to die of their burns, struggling to breathe.
It's very humbling for me to see this. As a scientist, I can distance myself from it to some extent, but then again I'm reminded by the number of colleagues that I've had and friends who died in surges like this, in pyroclastic flows. It also reminds me of scenes I saw when I was working in Mexico in 1982, 2 days after the eruption of El Chichon, where 1,800 people were killed in surges of this sort, and I had the unpleasant experience of seeing the bodies interred from that event. So it's a horrible sight.
Only a handful of volcanoes every century generate an eruption column. Few of those cause pyroclastic surge clouds. Even fewer are ever captured on film. During the 1997 eruption of Montserrat, a small surge was created. Typically, it was fast, hot, and devastated everything in its path. With little warning, it killed 20 people. This is what killed the people of Pompeii. It should have been the end, but Sigurdsson has found one massive final surge, far deadlier than all the rest. At 8 a.m., it swept down the mountain, through Herculaneum, through Pompeii, and out into the countryside beyond. Many who had fled the town and thought they had escaped were caught up in Vesuvius's final, deadly breath. In fact, the outer fringes reached the beach at Stabii, where Pliny's uncle was trapped. Again, his account exactly matches Sigurdsson's geological data.
The flames and smell of sulfur, which gave warning of the approaching fire, drove the others to take flight and roused him to stand up. He stood and then suddenly collapsed. I imagine because the dense fumes choked his breathing by blocking his windpipe, which was constitutionally weak and narrow and often inflamed. When daylight returned on the 26th, 2 days after the last day he had seen, his body was found intact and uninjured, still fully clothed and looking more like sleep than death.
News of his uncle's misfortune no doubt came from sailors and slaves who had been far enough away to survive the vestigial effects of the last surge. Pliny the Younger narrowly missed being overwhelmed by the massive cloud himself. It had travelled 30 kilometres across the Bay of Naples, looking like a black tidal wave, and hit the headland of Misenum just as it ran out of energy.
People bewailed their own fate, or that of their relatives, and there were some who prayed for death in their terror of dying. Many sought the aid of the gods, but still more imagined there were no gods left, and that the universe was plunged into eternal darkness forevermore.
The complete devastation inside Pompeii, but also the horrors found outside its walls, lead to the suspicion that many, many more of the refugees must have died while fleeing on the roads and on the beaches. The area covered by the final surge cloud is so unusually vast that only 1% of it has been excavated. In fact, no matter where the archaeologists dig, they always find bodies.
To the south of Pompeii, there was the river port, and another chance to escape could be to get to the river port, take a boat and leave. There are excavations there at the end of the 19th century in the actual river port. And now that area, which we call Marigine, is again under excavation by the superintendent of Pompeii, and more than 80 bodies have been recovered. They had jewels on them, which means that they probably had already fled Pompeii or the surrounding area and had taken shelter in that area.
This discovery of bodies far outside Pompeii suggests a huge death toll. Sigurdsson's prediction is that although 1,000 have been found, 10 times that died, half the population. 10,000 people failed to escape the final pyroclastic surge.
So the big question is, where are all the thousands of bodies of the Pompeians? And my suspicion is that they're down south, south of the city, south outside the city walls, buried underneath the pyroclastic flows, the surges, in the region of the Sarno Valley, the region where the Sarno River flows now. It's a region that is now fairly densely inhabited. It's a region where there probably will not be a lot of archaeological excavation in the future because of dense population. But if we want to find out more about the fate of the Pompeians, I think that's where we should look. Not in the city, but outside.
Pliny does not tell us if most Pompeians lived or died. Subsequent Roman writers make little mention of them. It is known that the Emperor Titus spent a fortune in redevelopment aid for the area. But the material that buried them and their bones tells us that they suffered one of the rarest and deadliest of all volcanic phenomena. A hot pyroclastic surge that choked and burnt them as a result of the collapse of one of the biggest eruption columns of all time. An eruption that few had a hope of surviving.
Pompeii. The story of its destruction is renowned the world over. A town buried by a volcanic eruption, only to be rediscovered 1,500 years later. A treasure trove of artifacts uncovered. The surviving archaeology has preserved Pompeii in its final moments. But it's also revealed so much about life before the eruption, extraordinary glimpses into the world of the people who dwelled here. From wealthy villa owners, like the entrepreneurial businesswoman Julia Felix, to lowlymen like Marcus Attilius, who fought and bled for the pleasure of others. Walking in their footsteps, I'll be exploring some of the most remarkable structures and meeting leading experts to better understand who these people were that made up this breathtaking town. This is the story of the people who called Pompeii home. Nestled in Campania, not far from the Bay of Naples, Pompeii's history covers almost 3,000 years. The town's origins date back centuries before Rome conquered Italy, but it became Roman in the early 1st century BC. Over the next 150 years, Pompeii filled with Roman-looking buildings, their walls covered with astonishing art and writing, sometimes elegant, other times obscene. It's Roman Pompeii that we see so much of today.
In 79 AD, Pompeii was home to about 15,000 people, and it would have been a hive of activity. This was a place of commerce. It was a place of connections across the length and breadth of the Roman Empire. It was a place of countless villas, both in Pompeii itself and in the surrounding countryside. Pompeii was a prosperous port town.
It was at the heart of one of the most celebrated parts of Italy for the Romans. The surrounding land and sea provided an abundance of resources. People of all nationalities ventured here, from Syrians to Britons. And emperors too would leave their mark, with many of them building lavish palaces along the Bay of Naples. Although it was never a significant city in the same way Rome was, Pompeii was a prosperous place, home to people from all levels of society. I've come to Pompeii to explore the stories of men and women who walked these streets almost 2,000 years ago. Extraordinary characters based all around the town who lived very different lives. To start my quest, I'm paying a visit to the house of one of Pompeii's wealthiest residents, where I'm meeting archaeologist Dr. Sophie Hay.
Welcome to the house of Julia Felix.
Now, who was Julia Felix?
Well, surprisingly, we actually know quite a lot about her, and that's because in 1756 they found a dipinto, basically a painted sign on the facade of this building, and on it, in literally big letters, was the name Julia Felix, and she was advertising for rent part of her house, so we know that this is her property. In terms of who she is, we know she's a citizen, which is very important, as she's got rights that a freed woman wouldn't have had. We assume that she's not married, because it's her name doing the business side of things on the painted advert. So we don't know whether she's a widow, but she probably hasn't got a guardian looking after her, which is usual in the Roman period. If you're a woman, you either have a husband or a father to deal with your businesses, but she seems to be going it alone. So I feel very strongly that she's sort of arrived in Pompeii and is shaking things up.
Just the sheer size of Julia Felix's property reveals a lot about her wealth. She had enough money to purchase not one, but 2 town blocks, known as insulae.
She joined these 2 blocks together, and in so doing got rid of a road that ran between them, you know, an important arterial road in Pompeii. So we're standing in her garden. Well, this is about 2/3 of the size of the property. And so the built-up part, her house, only occupies 1/3 of the space. So there's a lot being said there about ownership, wealth, and what she could do with her money.
This villa was one of the great mansions of Pompeii. You can imagine people walking past, peering inside as best they could from the nearby streets, and perhaps hoping to get a glimpse of this powerful and wealthy woman. And for those who were lucky enough to be invited inside as Julia Felix's esteemed guests, well, they discover a house built for the most luxurious living.
So Sophie, we've come to this interesting little enclave in the house of Julia Felix, but what is this area? What are we looking at here?
So we're standing in a dining room, which would have been called a triclinium. This, in terms of dining, is pretty much the most elite sort of situation you can get in a domestic context. You've got this couch with 3 sides, hence the word triclinium, and it's clad in marble, so sort of stating it's very sort of very posh dining area. And they would have been lying down on their sides, and behind them this little staircase that you can see is actually a water feature, and water would have been trickling down there, so they would have had, even in the heat, this sense of cool and calm. And then around them, they would have had scenes of the Nile. And you can see this beautiful blue colour, which is a very expensive blue pigment. And there's a crocodile and a little boat floating down the Nile.
I was going to ask, how could you tell that this is a Nile scene? But as you say, is it because of the crocodiles?
Absolutely, yeah, no. When we see crocodiles, we know that they're kind of representing the Nile, which for an elite person, this is a way of communicating that they know of the exotic. Egypt is a faraway land to little Pompeians, so they're trying to sort of communicate that they understand exotic. And in fact, we have this whole kind of water feature in the garden, which they would have been looking onto as well. And did that represent the Nile in kind of more of a sort of physical form? We don't know, but I quite like that idea that the Nile theme, water, is really important to this house.
And so we think that Julia Felix herself may well have eaten at this triclinium.
Oh, I'm pretty sure she would have done. She would have been a fool not to enjoy these surroundings.
But Julia Felix didn't just enjoy the private pleasures of her grand estate, dining on fancy furniture. She was an entrepreneur, capitalizing on her villa's position next to one of Pompeii's arterial roads to launch a clever business opportunity.
If we come through here, we get to see the very public face of Julia Felix.
Ah, so we've gone from private dining, and this is public dining. So talk me through it, Sophie.
So this is a bar counter, and people could come straight from the street, grab food and go.
Yeah.
But if they wanted to have a bit more of a leisurely lunch or food, they can come through, they would walk in, come through, and they could have food in her restaurant.
Well, let's have a look. Now, Sophie, this is such an interesting part of Roman dining because it's so different to the triclinium we were looking at earlier, isn't it? This feels more like 21st century going out to a pub or restaurant.
Yeah, it feels very familiar, this layout, certainly with these little upright benches, table in the middle. It's what we're used to. There might have been cushions on it, but essentially, yes, it's a very economic version of what we'd seen before and the opulence of everything.
And I presume the location-wise too, we've got the main street there, the amphitheatre not too far away. This is a prime location. This is cunning Julia Felix, isn't it?
Again, savvy again, yes. No, she knew what she was doing and she wanted to rent this space out, so she was getting an economy from it. But yeah, she knew she was sort of in the prime location for this sort of work.
In the corner of the restaurant was a small room, the kitchen, complete with an oven for cooking meats such as pork, lamb and duck, either served here in-house or at the counter overlooking the street. The whole building reveals Julia Felix as this impressive, independent businesswoman. Her well-placed restaurant would have been buzzing with activity, with people from all walks of life.
And do we know what status of Romans would have been able to come to one of these restaurants?
Certainly freedmen and freed women, supposedly. Slaves would be coming maybe to grab food for their masters and taking it back to the shops where people were serving. So there's a lot of hustle and bustle here, and this, for reasons, you know, this little restaurant here is probably a little bit of a scene of tranquility amongst the sort of bustle of the bar at the front. But still, it would be very lively. They're sort of talking animatedly, they're having discussions, arguments. We know that there are brawls in bars, drunken behaviour. So, you know, we've got a lot of sort of Roman life kind of encompassed in this one room.
As you walk around more and more of Pompeii, you start to notice an abundance of buildings linked with food. On almost every street corner you come across these counters, with built-in bowl-shaped hollows. The Romans called these places thermopoliums, what we would recognise today as fast food joints. Owned by entrepreneurial men and women similar to Julia Felix. And this is another of these popular food centres, a bakery, kitted out with millstones for grinding the grain and a large oven to cook the bread. Pompeii had more than 30 bakeries, filling the stomachs of the busy townspeople. This meant that whoever owned a bakery was reasonably well off. People like bakery proprietor Terentius Neo, famously pictured here alongside his wife. The couple lived several streets away from Julia Felix and converted part of their property into a bakery, no doubt selling their bread on the local street. 2,000 years ago, you can imagine walking along these streets with the smell of food wafting towards you from all directions. But in the area around Pompeii, there was one particular commodity that this region was renowned for. Wine. The surrounding hills were covered with vineyards, climbing up the great slopes overlooking the Bay of Naples.
So why was this area of Italy so renowned for its wine production, for its viticulture? Well, a lot has to do with Campania's rich, fertile, volcanic soils, because towering over this area of Italy was this mountain, Mount Vesuvius. Vesuvius's nutrient-rich slopes were incredibly beneficial for Roman vine growers. That, alongside this area's easy access to water.
The Romans knew that this mountain was a special place, not because it was an active volcano. That, it appears, they didn't know, but because its soils helped to nourish a successful wine trade. The Romans loved this fruit of the vine. They even had a saying, "In vino veritas," in wine there is truth. And many of Pompeii's residents were sure to take advantage.
Alongside the frescoes, the casts, the graffiti, and all the other extraordinary archaeology that has been preserved at Pompeii, archaeologists have also uncovered the vine roots that people were growing at the time of the eruption.
From villa gardens to taverns, vineyards were all around Pompeii. One of the largest was here, at the Foro Boario.
So we're just outside the Foro Boario now, and its location is what's key here, because just opposite the vineyard is the amphitheatre, and the vineyard's close proximity to this great arena, the ancient Wembley, was no accident. You can really see the business element here behind Roman wine production, because as the games ended and people filed out of one of the exits or entrances, they would come out of the amphitheatre, they would see the vineyard right there, they might pop into the vineyard owner's tavern, have a drink, possibly have a bite to eat too, and then be on their way. So this is a great example of that business element behind Roman wine production almost 2,000 years ago.
But it wasn't just local wines that would be on sale in Pompeii. This was a busy port town, with traders from across the Mediterranean and beyond arriving and doing business here. Sophie's taking me to one of Pompeii's best placed bars, run by a man called Amarantus.
This is definitely a bar. We've got a nice wide entrance to the street to catch that passing trade from the amphitheatre all coming back. There's actually a garden in the back. We're not sure whether they used it as a beer garden essentially, but yeah, this is the bar of Amarantus.
Sextus Pompeius Amarantus is another of these actual residents of Pompeii. His bar was located along one of the busiest streets of the town, a few blocks down from the amphitheatre and Julia Felix's villa. Sophie and her team excavated Amarantus's bar, the results were extraordinary. They found the remains of his dog and his mule. The archaeologists also uncovered a graffiti depiction of Amaranthus with a distinctly long nose, along with several mentions of his name, both on graffiti and on the amphory wine containers he sold right here.
Do we know what types of wine would have been sold in, let's say, this bar of Amaranthus?
So luckily for us, each of the amphorae that we know from the Roman world, slightly different shape for slightly different contents. And from the amphorae that we found 50 that came from Crete, and we found a few that came from Kos, which is in the Aegean. We've got plenty of local amphora because wine is grown all over the Vesuvian area, so we've got lots of that. But then there's one amphora from Gaza. So it shows that sort of Amaranthus may have had this quite exotic taste for wine and was trying to introduce it into the city. So yeah, he was, again, sort of a little entrepreneur in the wine world, perhaps.
I love how here, yes, you do have those local wines available for those Romans, but also this man is bringing in wines from, you know, this far-flung corner of the Roman Empire, from the Eastern Mediterranean too.
It's incredible to think that a little Pompeian had that kind of foresight to sort of import wines. We know he had a mule, he owned a mule, so he could have easily gone to the ports from here with his mule to collect the amphora off the ships direct from Crete, and then bring it all the way back up here to sell to his clientele. This sort of would have sustained him and his family, so he needed the income. I guess he was sort of probably experimenting a bit with the Gazan wine, but evidently the Cretan wine was really popular because he had 50 jugs of this stuff.
Sophie, what I love about this place is how it humanises almost ancient Pompeii with people now walking by today. It really helps, alongside the archaeology, get a sense, I guess, of what it was like for these people trying to make a living in ancient Roman Pompeii.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that sort of hive of activity, the streets would have been filled with people all the time in the Roman period. So yeah, you're completely right. The tourists actually are sort of replicating that sensation for us.
These uneven streets, amazingly preserved today, were the great highways of Pompeii. Lined not just with shops and bars, but houses too. Professor Valerie Higgins has dedicated her life to researching Italian archaeology, including here at Pompeii.
Walking down one of these streets in ancient Pompeii, what was the layout? Were villas interspersed with houses of, let's say, less wealthy Romans?
Yeah, they were pretty intermixed. I mean, it's not like today where we have really very zoned cities. They didn't really experience city life like that, so they are pretty intermixed. However, there are some areas that maybe are a bit more elite. Like elite people today, for example, rich people really liked was to have a villa overlooking the sea with a lovely sea view and also, of course, nice cooling breezes. So on the side of the city that has good views over the sea, which is the northwest side, there are certainly more nicer villas there. But what you tend to get are these blocks, which we call insulae, and a large part of the insula will be taken up with a very nice villa. But then when you look at it, you'll see that there are sort of fill-in parts that are smaller rooms that often only have an opening onto the street. And some of those are shops, some of those are bars. But we now know from more recent excavation that some of those were where poor people lived. So they would be physically within the same block as a very rich person, but actually wouldn't have any contact with them. They would have a room which quite possibly only had the door as a source of light and air. And those people would live in one room, essentially.
Today, these people are nameless. Unlike Julia Felix and Amaranthus, there was no writing on the walls that revealed who lived in these small rooms. Their stories have been lost. But we do know that they would have depended on the shops and services available along these streets.
But I think we have this idea that if you're quite well off, you go to restaurants, and there's something that sort of richer members of society do. But it was really the other way round in the Roman period, because if you were rich and wealthy, you would put a lot of money into having a very nice dining room and very nice cooks and very nice food. But if you lived in houses like this, which are just essentially one room, then you might not be able to cook. And so you would be very dependent on the bars and the takeaway places that were dotted all around the city.
Pompeii's bars and takeaways bustled with life, with noise. As did another, more infamous building.
This is a very, very dingy place. Small rooms, very dark stone beds, erotic frescoes all around. This is clearly a brothel.
The brothel is called the Lupinum, the wolf's den. But lupa in Latin was also the word for a female sex worker. This was where they sold their bodies for sex. You can see graffiti in many of the rooms mentioning specific prostitutes by their working names and what their clients thought of them. The sexual skills of Victoria, Felicula and Mola, the fellatio talents of Fortunata, her stage name Cruelly meaning fortunate.
So who would come here? Well, not the rich. They had slaves for their own sexual pleasures. It's an uncomfortable fact, but it's true. No, the people who would come here and pay for a prostitute's time were people lower down the social order, people who didn't have their own slaves, but also people who weren't afraid to leave their mark on the walls of this establishment, their sexual boasts of their actions in this brothel.
Placidus was one such man, and he didn't hold back with his crude boast. Placidus hic futuit quem voluit. Placidus fucked here who he wished. For objectified sex workers like Fortunata, life here must have been horrific. Although this brothel is the building in Pompeii that we most associate with sex, erotic scenes were everywhere, from the baths to the villas.
Now, who you could have sex with depended on your gender and on your status. If you were an elite Roman man, you were almost certainly going to marry. But that didn't stop you having sex with other women apart from your wife without any punishment. You could have sex with one of your slaves. You could have sex with a prostitute. And you could have sex with other low-ranking women. That being said, there were some women who were off limits, such as elite Roman women or Roman freeborn women. Who a Roman woman could have sex with was much more strict, only her husband. Because the Roman public world was one dominated by men, and these men showed a great interest in the chastity of their wives. Having a chaste wife was a mark of honor for these men. And so, if someone wanted to deride someone in a public office, they would send smears, they would send rumors that their wife had been unchaste, had been unfaithful. And so to police this, the Romans introduced a number of adultery laws, heavily steered towards women, where the price for adultery could be very high indeed.
If convicted of adultery, a Roman woman would almost certainly be divorced, her reputation forever tarnished. She would lose property and be reduced to a status little better than a lowly prostitute. Prostitutes in Pompeii and elsewhere in the Roman Empire belonged to one of the most low-status social groups in Roman society, the infames, which translates literally as the infamous. But they weren't alone in this class. Dancers and actors were equally looked down upon, and so too were the infamous combatants that performed in front of thousands here in Pompeii. the men who fought here.
This is the Pompeii Amphitheatre, the oldest stone amphitheatre that we know of from the Roman world. And it's also a home of the arena sports.
These spectacles, called Munera, followed a typical schedule. In the morning, you'd have beast hunts, where wild animals, sometimes exotic but mostly locally acquired, were pitted against each other or against specially trained fighters. Around midday, you'd have the executions. Condemned criminals would be killed in the arena in front of everyone, sometimes eaten alive by wild animals. Finally, the great climax to the Munera, the gladiatorial combats. Trained fighters were pitted against each other for the entertainment of the crowd.
These grass areas in the arena, around the arena, was where there would have originally been wooden seating, because this amphitheatre could house around 20,000 spectators, more people than the actual size of Pompeii itself. It's great testament to the popularity of these games, that people would venture to amphitheatres like this one to come and watch these blood sports.
These spectators watched on from up high as fighters emerged into the arena, chanting the names of these performers as they strode into view. Names like Elias, Princeps, and Felix. When you visit here today, you are literally walking in the footsteps of gladiators.
It's currently believed that roughly 10% of gladiators would die during one of these spectacles. But having said that, given the amount of fights a gladiator was expected to do over the course of his career, then the chances of him ultimately dying in one of these arenas was still very high indeed. Now, there wasn't a free-for-all in these arenas, in these amphitheatres, as to where you sat. Where you sat very much depended on your status. If you were an elite Roman, a patrician, a senator, for instance, you would be positioned here, closest to the arena floor, separated from the rest of the spectators. And I mean separated, because you'll notice here, this curtain wall. This was a symbol, a marker that those people this side were more important than those behind. They also, these elite figures, would come to this part of the amphitheatre through separate entrances, so they didn't mix with the rest of the spectators. As for the rest, they would come up, for instance, the exterior stairs of this amphitheatre at Pompeii. Women too were allowed to attend, but following a decree by the Emperor Augustus, they had to sit right at the back. It's another great example of how you experience pleasure, these arena sports in ancient Rome. Well, it very much depended A, on your status, and B, on your gender.
Munera proved incredibly popular amongst all ranks of Roman society, and with their popularity, another thing followed: gambling, where fans placed bets on their favourite gladiators.
This is another grim reality of Roman pleasures. As gladiators spilled blood for the pleasure of the crowd, some spectators would have little concern for the fate of the fighters themselves, and more concern over whether they made a profit.
For gladiators, the amphitheatre was a place of potential death. But these fighters actually spent most of their careers, their daily lives, in a very different place.
I've come to one of the most iconic buildings at Pompeii that's associated with gladiators. This is the Gladiator barracks.
Situated several streets away from the amphitheatre, today the barracks is one of the most popular attractions in the whole town. In 79 AD, this was the home of gladiators, where they ate, where they slept, where they trained, where they lived. Archaeologists discovered helmets and armour here, alongside the remains of the gladiators themselves, and mentions of star gladiators survive throughout Pompeii. Etched onto columns and walls, their names live on. Celadus the Thracian, who boasted that he was adored by the girls. Marcus Attilius, a freeborn gladiator who, in his very first fight, defeated a great champion called Hilarus. Most gladiators in Pompeii were slaves, but despite their low status, they were also incredibly popular. They were sexy, they were valuable, the most successful were superstars of the ancient world. Dr. Mario Grimaldi is an archaeologist who has been working at Pompeii for more than a decade. He's taking me to see something very special, not far from the barracks, a very unusual piece of graffiti. The scratched image shows two gladiators fighting against each other with different weapons. On the right is a retiarius-type gladiator, equipped with a trident and an arm guard called a manica. On the left is a sword and shield-wielding fighter, a murmillo or secutor. And beneath them both is a line, indicating the arena floor. The graffiti itself is quite low down. It's believed that it was made by children.
This corridor is very interesting and important because connected a very important street of named Stabiano Street to the theater, and after also to the School of Gladiators. And the decoration talk about of this changement to us, because the graphics say, okay, now I can go to see the theater, but I can go also to see the gladiators. And the children that live in this area was very attractive from the presence of the gladiators in this area, and created the graphics for the fighting that maybe for them is impossible to see in the amphitheater, but it's possible to see in the School of Gladiators.
This graffiti, created by children some 2,000 years ago, is an extraordinary piece of surviving archaeology. These lowly gladiators weren't just popular with adults, but young children too, fascinated by men like Celadus, brought to Pompeii from overseas.
For them, it's like the player of soccer today for our son. It's like this. The idea that this is the very strong man, come from different country, like our soccer players, arrive from the different country in a new city. And it's possible to see, to listen also different languages, see different color, of people, understand that there is a world outside the little city of Pompeii. And all of this was connection from the harbor near this gate from the presence of gladiators, of slave gladiators in this school.
We can never know for sure, but the famous freeborn gladiator Marcus Attilius did fight as a murmillo, with sword and shield. And it's not impossible that the figure on the left of this graffiti actually represents the champion beater himself. It's graffiti like this, and well-preserved buildings like the barracks, that makes Pompeii so important for archaeologists wanting to learn more about the gladiators themselves. Surviving archaeology has revealed so much about life in Pompeii 2,000 years ago. By 79 AD, this was a prosperous port town with people from all levels of society making a living. Overall, life in Pompeii was good. And yet beneath all of this, there loomed a terrible danger. Unbeknown to them, deep within Mount Vesuvius, A cataclysmic volcanic eruption was nearing. But Vesuvius had been sending warnings for years. Earthquakes had repeatedly plagued Pompeii. One of the most severe had devastated large parts of the town in 62 AD.
Now we know it was a severe earthquake from the archaeology because repair work was still occurring at Pompeii at the time of the eruption almost 20 years later. But despite this, for all intents and purposes, Pompeii was a city on the mend, getting back on its feet. Those buildings which had been damaged were either being repaired or in some cases improved.
These large-scale repairs are still visible today, right at the heart of the town. It's something that has fascinated Sophie for years.
What we have here is a really, really clear example of the original build in this sort of light stone, and this whole corner of the building had collapsed during the earthquake, and they rebuilt it but using a completely different material, these wonderful Roman terracotta bricks, and you can see how it's sort of slightly higgledy-piggledy but keyed into what the original building was like. But that is a really clear sign that there is serious damage being done.
So which came first?
These light blocks are first. This is all the original build.
Okay,
and all this later brickwork is kind of keyed in. Even the detail at the top, you can see where the pediment is. It's kind of following on from what was already there and what the initial architecture looked like.
So that's more triangular,
yeah,
maybe, and that one's been more semicircular, isn't it?
Yeah, there it is. It's sort of another really physical sort of manifestation of these earthquakes.
So walls, exactly. So walls like this can actually tell us a lot about the state of Pompeii in those years running up to the eruption itself.
Exactly, yeah.
We have no idea how people like Julia Felix and Amarantus felt about these earthquakes, but clearly life carried on. Business was good. Pompeii remained a vibrant town full of life. People from all walks of life still went about their daily business. And whilst wealthy Julia Felix would have had very little in common with a Pompeian prostitute like Fortunata, or a gladiator like Marcus Attilius, they do share a tragic tale. A great disaster that would bind their fates. When the sky turned dark, the sea rescinded from the bay, and the town was frozen in time.